like the final version, I think it came along really well. I think it's a strong, like, coherent argument. And if they don't do this one, then I don't know what they want to do.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Duncan Iveson. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Sydney, and I want to welcome you to the University of Sydney's City campus. It's wonderful to have you here for this incredibly important and exciting, not just event, but discussion and discourse. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Sydney is on the lands of the Gadigal people, one of Australia's first peoples, one of the first peoples in the Sydney Basin. We like to think of ourselves as an institution that has been around for 160 years, but of course, the land on which our campus is built has been a place of learning for more than 60,000 years, and that's a legacy we take very seriously, we're very proud of, and I want to acknowledge and honor tonight, and my respect to all elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us tonight. It's wonderful to have you here. So as I said, we're delighted to be hosting this event. This is an event, a wonderful example, I hope, of the way in which the University of Sydney is trying to work in new ways with government, with industry, and with the community through a range of different mechanisms. And of course, we're delighted to be working with the New South Wales Department of Education on this critical question of how can education enhance and underpin, not to put it too grandiosely, but human flourishing in the 21st century. What does someone in kindergarten today need to understand, need to know, need to learn in order to thrive, not just economically, but culturally and personally in the 21st century, in an age of artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, the 24-hour news cycle, the extraordinary things that our children and ourselves deal with every day. So we were delighted to have the chance to work with the department to explore these questions in great detail, drawing on the research expertise of my wonderful colleagues across the university and the extraordinary group of researchers who we'll hear from tonight are a wonderful exemplar for that. The report is remarkable. Reading it just before I came up this afternoon, of course, it's a University of Sydney report. It opens with a quote from Charles Dickens. That's completely appropriate. It's the best of times, the worst of times. I couldn't think of a better way, really, of setting the scene. There's so much that is exciting and powerful and extraordinary about technology and about artificial intelligence and the extraordinary impact it'll have on our culture and on our young people. But there are also as many questions raised about it that we need to begin thinking about, and we need to begin thinking about very quickly. We know at the university the significant social, economic, cultural challenges that it will present to not only our students, but the students coming behind. I mean, think of someone who was in kindergarten in 2005. Twitter hadn't been invented yet. Snapchat hadn't been invented yet. Quantum computing was a glint in David Riley and Michelle Simmons' eyes. Artificial intelligence was only beginning to be explored at the rate it is now. Think of the extraordinary challenges. Think of the extraordinary developments for that young person now, who is probably close to finishing high school and entering the University of Sydney, we hope. So we are delighted to be working with the department, to be working with Mark, and it's wonderful to have Mark back with us. And also it's a wonderful, I think, opportunity for the Sydney Policy Lab to demonstrate what we hope is the kind of convening power and the impartial way in which we hope to work with our partners. And tonight we'll have a wonderful opportunity to discuss with the research team and with Mark just what these challenges of AI for education actually bring to us. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mark Scott, Secretary of the Department of Education, to speak to us tonight about these challenges. Mark.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us this evening, and thanks to all who are partaking through the live stream that's going out from here tonight. Can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and the land in which we meet, and pay my respect to elders past and present. It's wonderful to have you all here to listen to researchers and leaders in this field as we think through the challenge of educating for a changing world. And this report that's being released and discussed today is but the latest instalment of a series of papers and pieces of work that have been commissioned by the Department of Education as we try and ask the fundamental question, how do we best prepare young people for the changing world that they will inherit? A young student who started kindergarten with us this year will leave the workforce. I think that's my phone ring. I'm sorry, that's Education for a Changing World. The young people who enter kindergarten this year will leave our school system in the early 2030s. They'll spend the vast majority of their working life in the second half of the 21st century. It's very hard to anticipate precisely what jobs will be available for them. There will be reports, and there'll be reference to this tonight, of many jobs that will go and many new jobs that will be created. We know that through an education system, we'll have to set them on a pathway of lifelong learning, because the jobs that will be created and the technology that will be created will force those young people to learn and master the new over and over and over again. So for us as educators today, it focuses the question, well, what should we be teaching? And how should we be teaching? And if we are committed to young people, how do we best prepare them for the complexity and for the change which will be a feature of their entire lives? I often discuss the tension I feel in running the New South Wales Department of Education with the team of educators who are there, because it's such a big system. It's one of the biggest education systems in the world. Today, I'm reliably informed, 800,000 children turned up to learn in our schools in over 50,000 classrooms and 2,200 schools. And I can tell you the logistical challenge, the interpersonal demands of running a system that big are profound for the educators in our schools. Each day is so demanding and is so complex and is so interesting and absorbing that could take all our time. But we know if we're really to be responsible to them, we need to be very mindful and conscious of the future. And I think great educators are a little bit obsessed about the future, in trying to think carefully through about the world we are preparing young people for. And that's why in the department, as well as running all these schools every day, we've set up a team that's specifically designed to focus on the question of how best we educate young people for this changing world. And it's from that group in the department that this report was commissioned from the academics at the University of Sydney, led by John, and that we can explore and debate and discuss tonight. So we're very proud of this work. We're delighted with the body of material that's now being published online by the department over the last year and a half. We're fascinated that it's generating such international attention, because the issues that we are debating and discussing tonight are of attention in every school and every school system around the world. And we're delighted to be able to provide a platform for intellectual and thought leadership around these issues. And we're delighted to be in partnership with the University of Sydney in doing this work. And we recognise that in trying to come to terms with the questions that we're addressing tonight, that no one person or no one policy area will have the answer, but it will require the very best efforts of our leading thinkers coming together and working and helping us frame the issues and frame the debate. So on behalf of the department and the department staff here, we're delighted to get in and wrestle and engage with the complexity of these issues. And I'm pleased that in the crowd tonight aren't just people who work in the department's policy areas, but we've got practitioners in the field. You know, we've got school principals, we've got primary school teachers, we've got secondary school teachers, we've got those who are wrestling with this complexity every day and are conscious of the burden and responsibility that they carry to best prepare young people for a changing world. So thank you for being part of it, and I look forward to sitting and joining in with you as we listen to the experts, we understand how they've approached the challenge, and they share their findings with us tonight.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Duncan, for setting the scene for us. I'd now like to introduce Professor John Buchanan. John Buchanan is the Head of Discipline Business Analytics at the University of Sydney Business School, and he's the lead author of this report. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, and I've been told I've got 5 minutes, so I'll be concise. First of all, I'd like to thank the Department of Education for taking a huge risk. When you get 6 academics from the University of Sydney, you're kind of hiring 6 unguided missiles. So that we really do appreciate that. And I'd particularly like to thank the people around Bronwyn Ledgard who gave us the space to develop these ideas. And it really was a refreshing experience to put a draft up and then be told that we had to really go and think about it a bit more. And that was done in a very constructive way, and I think the report reflects that. So what was the summary of our findings? You've heard the question, a child entering kindergarten today, what should the Education Department be doing for them? A great question. What was our process? We said across the University of Sydney there is a lot of collective insight, but it is often only expressed in small groups or by individually authored papers. We got together a team that encompasses some of Sydney's leading research engineers, a research psychiatrist, leading educator, someone from the business community who straddles AI and the business world, and a labour market researcher currently based at UTS. And out of that, we then commissioned and organised workshops across the campus in each of the different faculties, particularly in medicine and health, in engineering and IT, and in education. So what did we find? Well, I'm boiling it down into 3 general areas. First of all, about artificial intelligence. There is at the moment a moral panic about artificial intelligence. There's the robots are coming and they're going to wipe us all out. This is an unhelpful narrative, and we've basically said, let's unpack the elements of it. There's the overt impact on jobs and their content. More importantly, there's the covert impact, which is how it affects our abilities to communicate with each other and make decisions. And then it's amplifying impact. It makes the problems associated with inequality, globalisation and climate change either better or worse. So amplification can be for good or evil. And so our conclusion was, what's the impact of AI? It's going to lead to really good times, it's going to lead to really bad times, and it's going to lead to a combination of both. It's basically we're going into a quite complex and messy situation. So the question then becomes, how do you handle that complexity? And we address 3 key issues. The first one you've got to ask is, what types of pupils are we developing? And if you look at the narrative that is coming out of mainstream business bodies, they are particularly interested in flexible and adaptable labour. And we are concerned by this because we should be thinking about flourishing human beings, productive citizens, not just efficient and flexible labour. And we go through the International Classification of Human Functioning, the PERMA framework from positive psychology, and we go through the Ocean framework on personality to show that the normal way in which people think about labour is very narrow. When people think about 21st century skills, they say they're big, they're talking about creativity, problem solving, the like, but when you actually line them up against those validated frameworks for thinking about humanity, they are quite narrow. So that's the first thing, we should be developing flourishing human beings. The second big issue is, how do we think about skill? And it might seem obvious, but we take here a life course perspective. Might seem obvious, but from the mental health literature, there's really good work on mental health and mental capital over the life course. And a thing that is often overlooked in the debates about education, the future of work, is the importance of primary education. And we go to quite some trouble to actually say, when we're thinking about skill here, we've got to think about giving people basic learning dispositions. And that we don't talk about this enough. This is things like the ability to concentrate, the ability to follow an idea through, basic stuff like socially just getting on with people. And interestingly enough, just the physical side of work. The Greeks were very strong on this. We deal with the total person, not just their brain. And the primary sector has always thought of this and has got great ideas around it. And we think that's the first thing when we think about skill, let's think about the learning dispositions, because if you don't get them right, there's no foundation for moving forward. But probably the most important part of our work is challenging this idea that we need to focus on problem solving, collaboration, and the like in the abstract, what's called 21st century skills or generic skills. As we show in the report, This is a narrative that has been propagated for about 30 years. And we show that it is an unhelpful way of thinking about skill. And what I found interesting when we did our focus groups, or not when we did our workshops, they weren't focus groups, was actually a health sciences educator who said she was sick and tired of hearing about how she needed to create more problem solvers, because she said what we need, and she was particularly annoyed about collaboration, because she said you just don't need collaborative skills. When you're sick, you need a team of people with a whole range of expertise. You've got to have people with deep expertise with the ability to collaborate. And that's when it really struck me. It's not just in my area, labour studies, which has made this point. You've got the health sciences looking at it. We dug down, we found the positive psychologists are saying it, the cognitive psychologists are saying it, and the advanced labour market researchers are saying it. And I think this idea is something that has not got the attention it deserves. What is the future of expertise? Because if you don't have a domain of expertise, you don't have the foundations required to get those more general skills of problem solving and collaboration and the like. But then the final point of our substantive analysis of the qualities needed is we've got to be critical, however, of how expertise is currently defined, because it's very academically defined in the school system. Connell et al. Used to talk about the competitive academic curriculum. And we would argue that we need to make the academic side of life more practical, and on the vocational side of things, we need to have more powerful underpinning knowledge. I can elaborate on this, but I've only got 5 minutes. So how do we finish up? We talk about the implications for education. So when we're talking about education in an AI world, we've got to address the covert as well as the overt actions, and this means giving people the ability to critically assess how their connections with others are being changed, not just to simply accept the technology, but note how the technology is transforming their social relations. Secondly, we need to reconfigure vocational and academic education, and we put in there one of the best schools I've ever witnessed, which was in New Jersey, Bergen Academy, and that had been a failing technical high school. It got down to about 300 students, and a new group of teachers came in and they said, we're going to make this a vocational school like no other. And they've transformed it to the point where it is now like the North Sydney boys and the North Sydney girls high schools of New Jersey. There's queues of people trying to get into it because they have renovated that curriculum. It's still practical and applied, but the economics department is linked with major firms on Wall Street. The economics department works with the researchers in the local teaching hospital and the like. So they've actually rethought what vocational education is about. It's not just something for those who can't do the academic, it actually fuses the practical with the academic. And similarly, we cite very good examples of vocational education in Australia, where vocational education isn't a second-rate option, it's actually a high-quality option, which actually gives people really transferable skills they can take further in life. But then finally, we finish up on a pretty ambitious note, saying that if we're to change all this, it's not just a matter of changing the curriculum here or getting a bit more conscious about AI there. We need a new settlement around education. Social relations are not fixed in time. Education represents a balance of social forces. And we say that if we're to move more creatively into the future, two players in particular need to change their relationship with the system: employers and teachers. Employers are fast to criticise and slow to act, but they have a critical role to play because workplaces as sites of learning are highly underdeveloped. And we think as we move into the future, there needs to be a more vigorous debate, not about what educators should be doing more, but what should employers be actually doing to lift the education profile. And similarly with teachers, we think teachers are the absolute bedrock of the system, the anchor of the system, and they are too often passed over and dismissed in the so-called industrial models of education. Teachers, day in, day out, have to have the fight for crowd control. It's not just educating, it's actually keeping a classroom together. And we think the expertise that's required to be a great teacher is something that needs to be respected more and developed more. So I've probably gone a little bit over 5 minutes. I'm sorry about that. Thanks for having us. Thanks for taking the risk. We enjoyed working on this project immensely and we look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, John. I'd now like to invite Leslie Lobel to come up. Leslie is the Deputy Secretary of External Affairs and Regulation in the department and has led this work. And I'd also like to invite the panel up to take their positions now. So while they're coming up, Professor John Buchanan, who's just been introduced to you already. Next, I'd like to introduce Emma Hogan. Emma is the New South Wales Public Service Commissioner. Next to her is Stacey Quince, who is the Principal of Campbelltown Performing Arts High School. Next to Stacey is Dr. Sandra Peter. She is the Director of Sydney Business Insights. And that leaves Rafael. And next to Professor Rafael Calvo is an ARC Future Fellow at the University of Sydney and the Director of the Wellbeing Technology Lab. Welcome to our panel.
Well, hello everybody. Good to see you. I'm going to call out one thing first, which is that we not only have a diverse research team and a diverse people up here, we have a very diverse group of people in the entire room. And I really hope that as we go through this session, we're going to get some questions that we'll throw some prompts to the colleagues here. But microphone gone off. It's a good thing I'm a New Yorker. Anyway, but I really, we will leave time for discussion. And I really do hope we get all sorts of perspectives out here today. I'm going to pick up, start with a question that is actually diametrically opposed to what you were outlining as the scaremongering about AI. I'm going to start with, there's a eminent economist, Robert Gordon. And he, last year, wrote a book that got quite a bit of attention. But essentially, he says that there's been no era with greater innovation than the century that went between 1870 and 1970. Nothing before and nothing since comes close to that era in terms of changing daily life. And he points to electricity, steam, railroad, communications, chemicals, on and on he goes, and absolutely nothing comes close, including the 50 years of computers. Interesting. Okay. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to throw it to Rafa. May I call you Rafa?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'm going to start by asking you, is AI actually different? Is he wrong? Will AI actually have a significant impact? And if so, why?
Yes, I think it is different. The first part of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, and a lot of the inventions that you mentioned were changing the physical aspect of our work life. And it's true, a lot of those changes were huge. I will say they were toward the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. And that's what brought people like John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. The big changes of the first 40 years in England particularly brought together the two most opposing political views that we have today. Marx on the one hand and John Stuart Mill were based in London in the 1840s when the railways were spreading across England. The fastest basically the railways that went into the 1840s are the same they have today. But that changed the physical aspect. What happened then in the 1840s is happening today with the cognitive aspect of human beings. It's changing at the same speed that we saw at that time. We're seeing that from the cognitive, from the way we think, the things that we pay attention to. We are in the attention economy when they were, let's say, in the logistics economy, moving big volumes of heavy things and so on. Now we are in the same, but at the intelligence level, changing the way we think altogether. And I think that has a very significant impact for the conversation we are having here, because we are in the attention economy. So policymakers, schools, they need to be aware that media and tech companies are in a war for the kids' attention. And we need to teach them how to defend themselves. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that they will have. How do they keep their attention on the things that matter? It's already hard even for adults, right? So imagine for them in 20 years from now, how much harder, because the algorithms are going to be better. They already can recognize emotions. They can anticipate the things you are going to be thinking. They can anticipate the things you're looking for. And that's great. It has a lot of benefits. But they need to develop the skills of autonomy. The sense of agency, I think, is one of the most important skills that we need to have and develop in order to have a flourishing life.
Well, that's a terrific response to kick us off. I promise you I'll stop Robert Gordon after this next question. But he also says that that the era of prosperity is under significant threat, and he points to a number of headwinds. The demographic headwind of aging, climate change. He also calls out what he calls education stagnation, inequality, and what he says is we're in for sort of an extended era now of flat earnings. So Sandra, bet you didn't think it was going to go to you, but anyway.
It's doom and gloom, it has to come to me.
So Sandra, a lot of your work looks at these sorts of headwinds and what it means for business and what it means for the economy. Do you think he's right?
As I said, it's doom and gloom, so it had to come to me. I'm the person who has to talk about the impacts of AI, and every time I stand up, there's kind of a picture of the Terminator next to me, and the conversation is either they're coming to take our jobs, it's the end of the world, or they're coming to kill us. Neither of those things are happening just quite now, but I think what you picked up on there is actually quite important, because quite often these conversations about the future of AI revolve purely around the overt impacts of AI. How many jobs are going to disappear? Is it 47%? Is it 67%? Is it tasks? Is it jobs? We argue that this is actually not a very useful narrative to just look at that. If we are to understand the impact on the future of education, we need to understand, yes, the overt impact on the nature of jobs, and yes, some jobs will be displaced, some jobs will disappear, some tasks will be replaced, but there's also an argument for how we will work with machines. We see doctors working with machines, we see lawyers working with machines, and the nature of those industries is changing. But then there are more subtle things, and I think that gets to both the question around rising inequality and those sorts of issues, as well as to Rafa's answer, which is around this covert aspect, this covert impact that artificial intelligence has. And that's much more subtle, and it doesn't get nearly as much attention in the media or in general in our conversation as it should. And this covert impact is really on the types of social connections that we have and on the decision-making around us. So when we say covert impacts of artificial intelligence, what we really mean is trying to think really beyond social media, beyond Facebook, to all these recommender services that we have around us. Just think of the new business models that we have. So besides Facebook, we've got Netflix, we've got Amazon that can predict what we want to watch, what we want to buy next, what mode of transport we want to take home, at what time do we want to finish work and take home so that the traffic is not too bad. So all of these things have kind of seeped into the background of our lives and rule the way we interact with each other, what choices we make, what job we get, because they are now in recruitment and selection services, whether we get a loan or not, because they're now in finance and in insurance, whether we get that job or not, right? All of those things have become just part of the fabric of our society. And the questions there get really complex once we start to unpack it, because the new types of artificial intelligence systems that we're seeing cannot tell us exactly how they made that decision, cannot give us a a good explanation of why they might have rejected you for a loan, or why I didn't see, let's say, an ad for a vice chancellor at the University of Sydney because I'm a woman of a certain age and so on. So that gets much more complex. So there's that covert impact. And then the last impact is that of amplifying other things. You mentioned inequality, and really we're seeing this huge rise in inequality, and there's lots of people working on this. But last year, for example, it was about I think 1% of the population made 87% of the wealth that was generated. That's huge inequality. And AI is actually working to amplify that, not just through the types of jobs and the rate at which those jobs are changing, but also through this polarization of the jobs that we're seeing out there, right? You have companies like Facebook that employ 9,000 people who rate content. They watch suicide videos and inappropriate content and delete them. These are the low-paid jobs of the new economy. And we see them in that. We see them in the gig economy, a whole range of industries. Not only that, but when we're looking at inequality, think also inequalities of hope. The skill, the knowledge that you need to have to work in this new economy with these new systems, right? Who are the people who know what types of news we're getting on Facebook, who know what to read, how to prioritize that content, how much time to spend on the social media, and so on. So besides that, across things like, for instance, climate change, we see amplifying effects, whether that's more computing power to use this system, whether it's economic growth because we have these apps in the first place, or whether it's helping us deal with the effects of climate change.
So I might try to get some other panelists.
Well, you got me talking about it.
So if I can, I'm gonna ask you, I want to pick up on one of the things you're saying. So John, one particular element of kind of the AI impact that's often written about is the impact on first jobs. And that the kind of career ladder for young people, straight from high school, finishing a vocational degree, or even when they leave university, was to go into jobs that help them get practical experience and additional skill. And those seem to be hollowing out a bit with AI. What does this tell us? You're nodding your head, so I'm assuming you would agree with it? Or?
Absolutely. And I suppose what my take on this, though, is that people kind of focus on AI as the fundamental source of the problem. So we've seen big rounds of retrenchments recently, and they've all been blamed on AI. But I think that's missing the point. There was huge change, and I like Gordon's argument immensely, can I say. And if you look at the big change over the 20th century, one of the biggest ones was the washing machine in terms of liberating women and getting into the labour force. At the end of the Second World War, there was huge diffusion of change around microelectronics and new materials that have been developed in war. The problem's not so much the technology, but how the gains of productivity that come with that are distributed. So jobs in a dynamic market economy are always disappearing, and then other ones are reappearing. It's the rate at which they reappear is linked to the flow of consumption and production. And I think your headwinds are very important here.
So a lot of the people in the room here think of our role as getting kids ready to move out into that labour force. Now, if that stepping stone job is developing some cracks, what do we need to think about as educators?
Well, and sorry, you've obviously forgotten the report I wrote for you in 2002 on this very point, where I actually said educators, frankly, need to be more aggressive. It's not educators' role to simply absorb and respond to what else is going on. I think educators have a role for saying we should be defining the character of the policy mix. It's not the economy creates these problems and education runs around and picks up the pieces afterwards or prepares people to go in there. I think we as a society need to think we want a policy mix which takes the development of human capability as the endpoint. And all arms of policy should be directed at developing human capability. And that's not kind of some far left idea that's been picked up from the 1930s or whatever. That's Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, the kind of rock stars at the academy. And I think educators need to be more assertive in that regard. Now, that's the big picture, but they've got to be practical, right? We're not going to see that change anytime soon. And I think this is where when we're talking about rethinking vocational education in particular, we've got to give people, young people, the capacity to handle rejection, right? And one of the most eloquent quotes I ever picked up from one of the researchers I work with is he came back from interviewing a bunch of teachers and he said, I just got a really good insight. The teachers were telling me, what do we do with the bottom 80%? So you think about that. The education, and Sydney Uni is a big problem here because a lot of the education system is geared up around addressing the peak of the university system. I think we've got to think about how we equip people who aren't going to go to university and don't necessarily have to go to university to flourish. And that's why we take up these broader notions of developing humans in the broad.
Terrific. Emma, so yeah, you are new to the public sector. Welcome.
I'm very academically inadequate.
No, so we're that's why I let everybody know. But you have a long career in employment in private sector. So, but as you reflect on, in particular now, as Public Service Commissioner, what do you see coming towards the public sector? What do you think, is the role for the public sector in these sorts of debates in terms of our own employment relationships and so forth?
So I'm only 8 weeks in this week, so of course I have all the answers. I've probably got a lot more questions than I do answers. I think what struck me both about the report and the conversation that we're having now is in the same way that people in this room are thinking about the future of education for the future of work, that's happening at the same time we're trying to define what the future of work actually is. There isn't sort of this finite picture, okay, here you go, we can give that to you, now prepare for this. We're sort of changing the wheels on the car as it hurtles up the freeway, and the tyres perhaps represent all different things. So one of the opportunities I see is across the public sector, each division, marks, transport, health, everybody's looking at these pockets of what will the future of work be within my area. But I think at a policy level, we do have an opportunity because of the way the government is structured to have a sector-wide conversation about the framework for which we will think about the future of work and not just how we will apply it at professional university graduate kind of level, but at vocational graduate type of level and perhaps even school leaver level. I hadn't actually thought about that. I've just come from running a 2-day offsite with my team to start thinking about what's this future of work conversation for the commission, for the Public Service Commission to be having. And one of the get to know you exercises we did was, what was your first ever job? And it ranged from milk run to paper round to mine was a Saturday girl at the hairdressers. But actually what really struck us today was how many of those jobs actually don't exist anymore from only sort of 20 to 30 years ago. So I hadn't actually had the view of what will we do about that first role and what will that first experience be. And I think we have the privilege in the public sector to really think about those things at a deep level because certainly at a secretary level, I'm not sure, Mark, if you would agree, but there's one representative for almost all big groups of professions. So I think that's a conversation we should have, but it's not one at a sector level that I've necessarily seen too much on yet, albeit 8 weeks in. So
if that's only 8 weeks, we have a lot. That sounds fantastic. So Stacey, I'm now going to switch a bit to education and John mentioned, but, lots of people talk about 21st century skills, and this is what we need. I want you to, if you don't mind, tell us when you think about what you're doing at Campbelltown Performing Arts High School to get kids ready for the 21st century that they're already in. What do you think that means? What are you doing? What needs to change?
I think a lot of the discourse around education at the moment really presents education as a dichotomy. So it's either skills or content, it's either future-focused learning or traditional approaches, it's literacy and numeracy or it's 21st century skills. I think that's really unhelpful And I also think that it's really polarising. I think there's a case to be made. Sure, the button that you said you'd be able to operate from where you're sitting. No worries. It is.
So I think that idea that it's either or is really unhelpful. I actually think there's a space for all of those things. And when we support teachers to really work with students and prepare them for the future beyond school, they're doing all of those things. They know their students really well, they know the skills and the knowledge that students need to both do well at school but actually to perform well beyond school, and they draw on a whole range of pedagogical approaches, both approaches that have worked in the past in more traditional settings, but new and emerging approaches that allow students to apply skills and knowledge to a range of challenges in the local and global community. So at Campbelltown, we're working really hard in that space. We think that these skills really matter. We know that they're not the only things that matter, but we've developed a framework over the last few years to ensure that there's a shared language amongst teachers and students and the community about how those skills operationalise both at school and beyond school. We're providing students with a whole range of opportunities to develop products and services in response to challenges in the broader community. So our students do projects where they draw both on skills and knowledge at a deep level, and they are engaged in learning that kind of replicates real-world experience. So some of those examples are things like we've had students work with Campbelltown City Council over an extended period of time to increase the use of local parklands and develop a deeper understanding of the importance of sustainability in the local community. And in that project, our students created a range of products to be implemented within that parkland to increase the use of that space. So one group worked on identifying ways to get young families to use the parkland more effectively. They created an interactive playboard for young people and some signage with QR code embedded information in it around the biodiversity in that area, and they pitched that concept to council and it went into production and it sits in the parkland. We had another group of students who developed a picture book to teach young students about the flora and fauna in that parkland. They worked with teachers to create a range of teaching and learning activities that go with that picture book, and that's been distributed to schools and public libraries in the broader community. And those, I could give you a dozen other examples, but those projects that students are involved in both allow them to develop deep knowledge around science, around English. They allow them to develop skills like literacy skills, collaboration skills, critical thinking skills. But most importantly, they demonstrate to our students that they've got the capacity to make a difference in the world beyond school. It develops in them a sense of agency, it empowers them as young people, and it really instills in the whole broader community this notion that the young people who are in our schools now have already got the capacity to work beyond the four walls of our school.
Well, I was going to ask you, Emma, what you thought of all of that as a parent. But I think, no, but as a parent, and there's probably parents on the panel, so I throw that open to anybody who either has a child in school or had one. When you think about what you want for schooling, what comes to mind?
So I have an 11-year-old stepdaughter and I have a 1-year-old baby. Or she's 1 on Thursday. I'm actually more worried about my 11-year-old at the moment than I am about 1, because I feel like my youngest daughter, we're really sort of thinking about this now in terms of her future, but I worry for my 11-year-old that we won't necessarily have our thinking straight in education or work by the time she's graduating, and I worry about that. And I worry about that because some of the language that she uses with me, she's sort of got this view that if she's not good at science and technology, she might not have a future. And some of the language that I think is happening, you talk about the amplification of the AI argument that robots are coming to rule the world. Well, that sort of feels like it's happened to her a little bit around this idea of STEM and STEAM, etc., that if she's not good at these particular things, she might not have a future. And she doesn't sit down with me and say that, I'm really worried about my future, but some of the language that she uses sort of implies that she feels like she has to be really good at things that perhaps are not natural to her, and it stops her from exploring the things that she's actually really good at, which are much more around creativity, storytelling, stuff like that. And she doesn't necessarily hear in the language of society at the moment that that's as important. And maybe it's not, but there are natural inclinations, I think, in kids to explore the things that they're good at and the things that they enjoy. And so as a parent, I worry about the narrative and the messaging right now about, whilst we're all sorting out this future for our kids and the future for adults and the idea of lifelong learners, that we're also, as families, talking to our kids about their, sort of holistic worth.
Well, Rafa, that's a lot of what you think about as well.
Yes, in many ways. I have a 12-year-old boy, and he's more oriented towards technology, but mostly like video games. So he can get engaged with a video game literally for 4 hours straight. But my concern is that those technologies have been designed to absorb him. And unless the school is more engaging, he will lean towards playing video games or do other things that are more attractive and are designed to do that. And then one has to play the role of the arbiter and say, no, you have to limit to 2 hours or whatever, right? And it's the father or mother who has to put the limits. But I would like the schools, for example, to be, and I'm not saying it's easy, but more engaging in ways that he feels more inclined to other topics of interest, rather than just a video game. And there are psychological drivers to engagement. So we studied that in my research lab on how you design technologies. And those are the same psychological drivers that engage people in schools or in the workplace: autonomy, competence, relatedness. Those three factors have a huge impact on what kids want to do at school or what kids want to do when they use a technology, a video game or something like that. I think those principles are very often used in schools. Like you were saying, all those examples are fantastic. And I would like to see more of those in my kids' school, at least.
But Leslie, can I come in there? Like, one of the most inspiring case studies I've ever done, because I am a workplace researcher, was looking at a nurse who, and I picked this up when I was studying an abattoir, and it was one of the best workplaces I've studied, actually. You don't normally think of abattoirs as kind of best practice sites, but they had, we were studying them because for every 10 workers, they had not only a supervisor, but they had an on-the-job trainer. And what I noticed is that there were a lot of Indigenous people here, and I said, well, where did those Indigenous people come from? And they said, oh, that's part of the program we've got with the local school. And I've traced it back, and a nurse who'd been working in Indigenous health for 20 years got sick and tired of nursing Indigenous people to an early death. And she did the research, and she found that if they stayed at school for 1 year longer, on average, they'd live for 5 years longer. So she went in and worked out that getting kids engaged with school was critical for increasing longevity. But she tracked through a group of Indigenous kids and found they got to school but only walked through the school gate. They didn't quite make it to the classroom. And so she then said, well, how do I get them engaged? And she ultimately found that by getting them jobs, part-time jobs, getting the on-the-job trainer to explain to them why they needed their maths and their English, led to then high motivation at school. And I think this is why, when I talk about a new education settlement, employers aren't just there to shout from the sidelines. I mean, workplaces are profoundly, potentially educational sites. Now, not every workplace is a cathedral of learning, right? And you don't just say any employer puts their hands up can be drawn in. But I think that we've really got to mobilise a broader constituency. Teachers and schools cannot do it on their own. There's so much thrown onto schools, and I think this is where the settlement comes in. And I think this is where employers have got to step up and think, I'm going to take a role here. Now, that's a very radical agenda, and that's not saying employers take over the curriculum. It's saying employers take responsibility for part of the curriculum, and that's what that abattoir was doing.
Yeah, so Sandra, Again,
I'm uniquely differently qualified to answer these questions because I don't have children.
No, that's right. But you do know business.
I do know quite a bit, and I've been asked recently to talk quite a lot about this in school. So whether it was like Pymble Ladies College or Brisbane Grammar Girls or Grammar Boys, quite often this question comes up of what do you tell them right now and what should they be most concerned with? And one of the things I found most wonderful in those conversations is moving the conversation from this is about AI and STEM to this is about asking the right questions and instilling in them a sense of agency. This future is not happening to them. We don't have to prepare them for the future that is coming regardless of what happens. These are the kids who will build this future. So instilling in them that sense of agency, the fact that they can change this, that they can think differently about how these things come into our lives. And I was in one of these big halls presenting, and always the questions about autonomous vehicles, because if you talk AI, it has to be autonomous vehicles, and they are coming, and they will be here tomorrow. And we put up this picture, so I moved here from the Netherlands, and we put up this picture of Amsterdam, and it's this really busy street, lots of cars, lots of people on bicycles, lots of pedestrians, all walking around, the lights turn green, and then just everybody goes. And there's bikes in between the cars, and there's pedestrian and everything else. And everybody seems happy, everything's moving along. And then we asked them, what would happen if we put autonomous vehicles in there? Would it make it better? And the answer from the kids is, well, no, you'd have to get all the people off and all the bicycle off and fence them off, and it would be all this order and nice, but it wouldn't be a city in which you'd want to live. Now, our kids have to learn that they have to answer those questions as well about how we want to live in that world. So I think that's a really big one for me.
So back to you, Stacey. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ingredients that go into successful education, but kind of the triad is curriculum and assessment, structure of schooling, and teaching, leadership along with that. I mean, there's probably plenty of others. I've boiled it down too simplistically, but I mean, if you could wave your magic wand and tell us what we should be doing to make things easier and better, what would you change?
There are a whole range of things that I would change, but there are a whole range of things that I'd keep. I am also a parent of a 15-year-old, and actually I'm really optimistic about the future for her. I know that schools are doing some fantastic work. My daughter goes to a New South Wales public school, and schools are doing great work to develop in students the skills and the knowledge that they need to thrive in a whole range of areas beyond school. What I would change are a few things. The first, I'd have a very close look at assessment. We know that there's been lots of discussion in the media lately about NAPLAN and the impact that discourse around NAPLAN has on driving an agenda in schools. I welcome that discourse. I think for too long the focus has been in some places on literacy and numeracy, and there is scope for us to broaden that. And I can see that happening. I also think in terms of assessment, high stakes assessment particularly, there needs to be a good long look at the HSC as an exit credential. We know some of the most innovative systems around the world are thinking differently about credentialing, and we know that they're providing students, for instance, to have an opportunity to put together a curriculum that is far more personalised, that allows students to undertake, for instance, internships whilst they're still at school. There's opportunities for them to develop portfolios of work in areas of passion, and that we don't necessarily have to run a set number of subjects and for a set period of time. I also think there is a need to relook at our curriculum and our syllabus documents. We know that a number of them are really content heavy, and the research tells us that if we're really going to prepare students for the world beyond school, develop the knowledge and the skills and dispositions that they need opportunities to be engaged in applied learning, to solve real problems, and that requires deep work. And some of our subjects really require people to cover so much content that it's difficult to do that at a deep level. I also think, the greatest assets in our schools are our teachers. I work with the most phenomenal professionals who know their students really well and can really excite young people about learning and turn them on to learning so it is an exciting place for them to be. So we need to continue to invest in our teachers. We need to give them the time and the space to have a look at new and emerging pedagogies. The research in education for a long time has been backward facing. What's worked in the past in more traditional approaches? There certainly needs to be some investment, and I'm not just talking within our system, I'm talking across the profession, around what are the new and emerging pedagogies that really support our students and will prepare them to flourish in the world beyond school. And once we know that, we need to make sure that we operationalise that through professional learning for our teachers. How can we support our teachers to develop an understanding of the types of pedagogies that they might draw on to prepare our students for the future? I see that there are teachers already doing a phenomenal job of that, but I think across the profession as a whole, that needs some really close consideration.
I think you might get clapped again, but look, what I'd like to do now is throw it open for questions. There are roving mics, so we'll get around, and I again encourage you to offer question or comment from a range of perspectives.
Thanks, Leslie. It's been fantastic listening to your Murat Dizdar from the New South Wales Department of Education. It's been great coverage and very therapeutic for me too, around worrying about students. I've got a year 4 daughter and a kindergarten son in a great public school. I worry as well, but not for either of those children. I worry for the teacher that they've got, and not because of me. I just want to put that on record. It's not because of me. I see how dedicated they are. I see how committed they are. You covered that territory really strongly, Stacey, and I see that when I've got the access areas all passed across public schools. So I've got a lot of hope, like you've covered. But for people in system roles, what could you call out that we need to do stronger and better? Because I don't know of many professions where you've got to stand up and deliver and perform, whether that's 5 periods out of 6 for a high school or 6 hours in a day. You know, I still pretend when I visit schools and give my 10-minute best shot, and then, walk away for that teacher to pick up the mess I've just left behind in, wondering if I've still got that capacity and capability. So, I'm really heartened by John Buchanan's comments around the anchor in the system. But what would you really say to us at a system level that we need to do far better for our teachers to prepare them for being able to best deliver for the coverage around skill capability and content? And I wonder what your views are, Stacey, around parents, because if I put my parent hat on, and on the odd occasion where I get to the ocean, pick up my children and hear the parent discourse, I wonder what you're looking for us from parents as well, because the best outcomes are in partnership, we know that, between staff, students and parents. So your views in both teachers for the system and parents for the system.
Sure. The first thing I think we need to do better as a system, and I know there's been a lot of discussion around this, is really identify powerful practices that are already happening in our schools. There are so many powerful practices already happening in individual classrooms and across schools that are having a huge impact on the achievement of learning outcomes, engagement, and they are preparing students to develop the skills that they need for the world beyond school. So one of the things I think we need to get better at doing is capturing examples of that practice and finding systematic ways to share that. The research and development piece I've already spoken about, but I genuinely think there's a need for us to think about really deeply what are the sorts of pedagogical approaches that can have really strong impact, and work hard to identify them and then put them in the hands of teachers so they can draw on that range of strategies. I also think in Australia sometimes we tend to look inward. There is a huge education community globally who are looking at these exact same issues as us. Some systems are doing a better job of tackling some of these issues than we are, but I do think we need to be doing horizon scans to have a look at what's happening at a global level and how can we learn from some of those systems globally, not just based necessarily on PISA results, because we know they can be narrow in some respects, but actually there are a whole range of other ways that we can have a look at identifying really effective practice across the board. And as I said, for teachers to operationalise this when they're teaching 5 periods on a 6-period day, and we're expecting them to engage with research and think differently about learning and start to use a whole new repertoire of strategies, we really need to provide them with the time and space to have deep, collegial, cognitively challenging conversations and to co-develop and to co-teach and to co-evaluate. We know that when teachers collaborate, pretty magical and powerful things can happen. In terms of parents, we've worked really hard with our community to engage them as learning partners. So we know that when parents partner with us around new models of education, that we can get terrific buy-in, and we think that actually as parents they've got something to say about the future of learning for their young people. So we've got a pretty different model of learning happening in Year 7. Students are engaged in integrated curriculum in humanities and STEM. They're creating a whole range of products and services to address real world issues. So this week students are launching a book about extraordinary people in the local community who've made a difference to the lives of others. They've co-published that across Year 7. We've also got students who are sharing products they've developed to reduce the use of non-renewable resources at school and at home. And our parents are right behind that model. It sees 60 students in a learning space with 3 teachers. And the reason that they're partners in that is because we pulled them into the tent early. So we looked at what the global research told us about learning. We developed a model based on a whole lot of work that we'd done within our context and gathered evidence around what we thought we could scale up. Once we thought we had a picture of what that looked like, we took it out for consultation, and we had over 200 community members come into our school for that consultation evening. We talked to them about the global research. We talked to them about what we'd already done in our school. We talked to them about what our proposal was and why we wanted learning to look like that. And then we had facilitated table group sessions. We didn't just tell them this is what we're going to do. We had a teacher at every one of those 35 tables, and the teacher's job was to listen and to capture recommendations from those parents. And the feedback we got from them was phenomenal, but they did make some suggestions and some recommendations, and those recommendations got put into the model, and then we talked to the parents about, why the recommendations that we'd taken on board. Our exhibition of learning is another opportunity for them to be partners in the learning process. So when our students have finished their projects, we open the school doors up and we invite the parents in to have conversations with our young people about the learning that they've been involved in, and they provide us with feedback through exit slips and surveys. So our last exhibition of learning for Year 7 saw 400 community members come in, and our 12 and 13-year-olds got up with absolute confidence and talked about their learning and the work that they'd done and how they know they'd done a good job and what their next steps were. And we captured feedback from parents again, and we feed that back into the cycle of what we're doing. So I think that partnership with parents is really critical.
That's terrific, Stacey. I just want to make sure we get some questions. There's one over there.
Hi Stacey, my name's Liz Jackson. I've been an educator for the past 10 years and I've recently moved out of that space and now head up as the education director at startup.business, and we work very closely with schools at the moment. So I wanted to congratulate you about talking about the communities of practice, and we know how important they are, and we've seen some exceptional work across Australia in both rural and regional areas. My, I guess, biggest concern, having come from the education space and now moving out and working with the teachers, is that there's a lot of difficulty around the support that teachers get, and we know that by 2030 there needs to be 14.9 million more teachers trained to reach that quality education framework for the Sustainable Development Goals. So what else can we do, and when's it actually going to be actioned in supporting staff, in providing them with the agency that they need to be autonomous learners themselves and really change the focus and provide opportunities for their students to be exposed to communities of practice? I think more importantly, it comes from the leadership. So how do we also support principals in that respect as well?
I can really probably only talk about this from a school perspective and what I do to ensure that my teachers are not only autonomous, because actually I also want them to be collaborating, but we use our school funds and our professional learning funds to release teams of teachers to work together and collaborate. We privilege that. We think it's really critical that they're provided time to do that. We build time into their timetable to allow those conversations to happen as well. At a systems level, there's a whole range of things that are in place around mentoring our early career teachers as they enter the profession. One of the key principles, I guess, that guides the work in my school is a concept of ownership. So the models that I've talked about, all of the projects that I've mentioned, are all co-developed with teachers. I don't go into a teaching staff room and say, this is what we're going to do. There is opportunity at every step along the way for teachers to both contribute to the development of those models, to provide feedback and critique to each other. I'm in their boots and all developing lessons with them. They provide feedback and critique to me. But I think developing a culture in schools that allows teachers to have ownership and provides them with the time and space to have those conversations is really critical.
Can I just come in on that one too? There's a political dimension to this, and that is the valuation of teachers in the community. And if you're going to talk about support for teachers, there's got to be a shift in resources. And the thing I really like about the New South Wales Education Department is that they're not afraid to get big ideas going. And I think that's really good. I mean, I know they've employed me for this project, but not many other education departments in Australia are taking the risks that this agency is. I'd just say we need to ginger the debate up a bit more. Profit share of GDP has gone from 20% to 30% over the last 30 years. What's the private sector done with it? They've given us a GFC and 15% underemployment. I think we need to have a debate. As a society, we are more productive than we've ever been. We've got to have a debate about, well, what kind of society we want to be going to the future. John Dawkins, and I know he's, the former decent John Dawkins, but he coined an expression in the 80s called the clever country. And I actually thought that was quite a nice idea. And if we have this idea that as we mature as a nation, we become known as the educated nation, I think that we've got to do that. It's only if you get that sense out there that you're going to get the shift in resources, you get that 30% of profit share down to, say, 25% and 5% going to education. Can you imagine if 5% of extra GDP went in education? You wouldn't know yourselves. There'd be less yachts on the harbour, there'd be fewer BMWs on the road, but we'd have a better education system. These are the kind of questions I think we've got to put out there.
I think over here is a question. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I was just going to say that I think, not so much in a political sense, but I think organisations need to take a similar approach to learning as well. I think that this idea that we will need to create lifelong learners, organisations need to take a really different view around what learning in the workplace means, especially, we talk about reskilling, but we don't yet talk realistically about how we might do that in a way that's not just send everybody on a course and hope for the best, but actually more dynamic ways of learning on the role and evolving your career through sort of lattice moves rather than ladder moves, if you like. I think there's a lot more thought that needs to be given to learning in the workplace. It's not just, there's a lot we could learn from the education department probably on that, but I do think, again, they're two things that need to be running in parallel.
Oh, hi, Kathy Nicholson from the New South Wales Teachers Federation, recently back from TAFE again. And Johnny, so wonderful to listen to you as usual, flexible and adaptable, wondering if that was code for dispensable in a casualised world. But that's not my question. My question is, the spectre of commodification of education and marketisation of education has seen the decimation of the TAFE sector across Australia, critical really to a clever country. And I'm wondering, I liked the stuff you said about teachers becoming more assertive. I'm wondering what you think can be done to reignite a passion in this country to invest in vocational education.
Well, I'm kind of the number one fan of vocational education, and I think there's a lot of people who are interested in this question. John Howard even talks about the low status of vocational education. The heads of the BCA's even saying, TAFE's been run into the ground. It's what do you do about it? And this is why, I use the expression very clearly, teachers are the anchor. You cannot have a quality education system without some anchor for quality. And the education department's very strong on that. But we've also got to not look backwards, we've got to look forward. So what does that mean? What does the teacher of the future look like? And they're probably going to look a bit different to the teacher of the past. So I'm a labour market researcher. We tracked 8,000 workers over 5 years. And one of the most stable occupations were teachers. when you track them. And I think we've got to think about how we can give teachers a chance. You know, if you're a history teacher, I think it'd be great if they could have a secondment in a policy department for 6 months and learn about, you know, writing briefing notes and policy papers, and get policy people in teaching side by side with teachers. On the vocational side of things, some of the best employers are educators. They see themselves as the leading practitioner of the craft in the workplace. Those people need to be supported. So for me, I'm optimistic in this regard. I think the 30-year experiment with shareholder value is now coming under very critical questioning. You know, the Banking Royal Commission is opening up huge space. And when you question shareholder value, well, what's going to replace it? And this is where notions of like multi-stakeholder learning organisations can become taken seriously, as opposed to something that's going to compromise shareholder value. So I know that's a long way of answering your question, but basically if we want to get beyond the current mess we're in vocational education, we've got to have a broader vision of education, and we've got to tap people's love of learning, and in particular we've got to get the best employers involved in the teaching community, and we've got to get the best teachers in with the employer community. I know, you know, people know I'm not a flunky for the business community, but they have a critical role to play here. Currently they're kind of missing in action. They kind of throw grenades in. They have you know, something from Boston Consulting Group, they throw it in and they run away. But what do they do day in, day out? How many structured on-the-job placements are they creating? How many of them are like that abattoir and putting an educator in next to the supervisors? These are the things we need to ask of the employer community, because they've got a very important role to play.
There's a question in the back.
Alan Fecketer, I'm a university academic in the computing area. We've heard some wonderful stories and visions, but I'd like to direct the attention to what I think is a dysfunction in the system at the moment. The story of AI is that it's going to get rid of a lot of jobs or create new jobs, but there'll be a lot of competition. And that message of competition is flowing all the way through. We see, you know, grade 3 kids going off to coaching so that they can get into an opportunity class. Everywhere there's a story that there aren't going to be enough opportunities, and so people have to fight against one another. How can we turn that around so that we can instead pull off the cooperation and the group learning and all of the wonderful things you've spoken about?
I wonder if I could throw that to start with, Rafa, because you think, as an AI scientist, you think a lot about well-being in AI. And I wonder if you could kick off.
Yes, I do. And I was reading an article over the weekend on algorithmic bias. And what happens in algorithmic bias is, let's say you do a query in your favorite search engine. The top hits are the ones you're more likely to click on, right? And because they are the most likely to click on, are also going to be the ones that are going to appear more and more often. So something that started there is more likely to appear and become bigger and bigger and bigger. And that kind of biases happens in many different ways. So there you have the system, that is the AI system that produces the search results. But in policy making, you have also similar forms of bias. And that possibly has to do with what Alan is saying about, for example, selective schools, where you will have groups that can send the kids to tutoring to train for the selective school for years ahead of time, and they're more likely to get in there, and then they're more likely to perpetuate biases in the system. I personally didn't want my kids to be spending, Saturday going to tutoring, math tutoring. But then when I see in some schools is that if you're not in the opportunity class, maybe the opportunities are, the difference is very big. And maybe it's just circumstantial. So I don't know the statistics, I'm not from educational research, but that's what I see as a parent and what I see when I talk with other parents, especially those who don't want to fall into that bias creating system. So the Australian system is, I come from Argentina, for example, the vocational education is the role model. Everybody there who works in vocational education sees Australia as the way to go. And I think it happens in many different aspects. So we are very lucky. We have a multicultural society that is fantastic. We have a system that is very fair, I will say. It has obviously different levels of inequality, and it has a government that cares. No? And those three things are rare. Not many countries have that, so we are very lucky.
Stacey, you said before you're very optimistic.
Yeah, to the question around selection and the support that's provided to students. I am a principal at a performing arts high school. About 40% of our students get in via audition into dance, drama, music and circus. We know that the arts is important, has the capacity to change lives, and we ensure that all students in our school have access to the arts. But we also ensure that all students in our school have access to academically rigorous and deeply engaging learning experiences through STEM and through humanities. So again, I don't think it's an either or. And if we go back to this question around how we can equip our teachers and really position them to provide the best possible support for all students, then that notion of coaching and getting into a selective school falls away, because actually all our public schools have the capacity to provide deep, rich, engaging, academically challenging learning experiences for all our students. And our teachers are best positioned to make decisions about the sorts of learning experiences they want to offer to students in their class because they know those students really well. So I'm really optimistic because I see so many practices that are happening across the system that are doing this work well. And it's not without its challenges, there's no doubt about that. But we know that this has got the potential to scale. I presented at a conference this morning. There was about 20 schools there represented, all there with teams, and every single one of those schools in a regional area is really committed to this work. They were specifically wanting to find out about how they can help their students to develop both the skills and the knowledge they need through applied learning models to really deepen engagement and learning. And I hear those conversations all the time. That's what makes me optimistic.
There's another question? Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for interesting report and for interesting presentation. My name is Lena Markowska. I'm from the Center for Research on Learning and Innovation. And my question will be related and slightly different. So we are talking now about AI in general in the society, but AI also will change education itself. And specifically, I imagine that perhaps teacher's job will not be the same in 2040 as it is now, and will be completely free of artificial intelligence. Are there just really looking for panel's thoughts on this issue? So how educational system as the system will become more enabled by artificial intelligence, and how teachers' jobs will change in 2040? Thank you.
Anybody?
Probably not me.
I think that technology will be an enabler, and I think artificial intelligence will change, for instance, some of the ways that we might assess students and some of the ways that we might get data back around student performance. But that is not the end game in and of itself, and good teaching relies on great relationships between teachers, students and parents. And lots of the research that's been done makes it really clear that teaching is not a profession that's at risk in terms of going all together, but we do know that the nature of teaching will change slightly. I see that that technology has the capacity to free us up from some of the work that we do currently around admin and assessment and marking, and provide us with rich data quickly. It won't be the only way that we assess students, but actually I think that the role of teachers and the relationships they build with students are fundamental, and I think we'll continue to see how important that is, possibly even more so given the role technology plays in students' lives outside of school from now till 2040 and beyond.
And can I come in there? If you look at the way computerisation went through the engineering and manufacturing sector in the 60s and 70s, there's very good comparative studies comparing how the Americans did it and how the Germans did it. And the Germans used advanced computational power to augment the power of their trades and their craft people. The Americans did it to displace it. And I think there's quite an interesting debate, which I read coming out of some of the references you actually gave me, Lena, on the future of curriculum, and it actually showed that technology should be seen as something that can enrich the curriculum, not replace the teacher. And I think that's the way to have the debate. But it is quite a transformation. But I think, once again, it's something we get excited about, not threatened about. But that's as long as we take, say, the German approach out of manufacturing as opposed to the US.
last year there was a spate of economic analyses about which jobs were going to disappear. And there was a bit of an exchange on Twitter where people pointed out that Mark's job was going to go before a teacher's job.
Sorry.
Last question goes to... Okay, Natasha.
Hi, Natasha Watt, Transformation Team Department and Woonona High School. Can't decide which one. Still new to both. My question is around systems. Not all kids come from families where they have the cultural capital to navigate things, and not all parents can do that. There's been a lot of anecdotes around this fairly educated group of people and being parents, but what about those other children from other families? How do we ensure that our systems look after those people so everyone has access and opportunity? In particular, how do we make sure our system of syllabuses and what's written in those, everybody's looked after as things evolve? And secondly, around systems of assessment, there is a quick jump to critiquing the HSC like it's the issue. What the HSC still does do is draws a, it writes into it a standard across different subjects that all kids can access, no matter what their background, no matter what their school. So it still allows all kids access to a higher intellectual standard too. So how do we make sure all kids are accessing that if they need to and want to and can do?
Well, can I have a first go at that? Once again, I don't think education can solve all those problems. I mean, I think this is where you've got to look at links with social policy. And I notice we've got people here from the Smith family, for example. You know, schools cannot do this on their own, and you've got to look at what it takes to build communities. Like, for instance, I know in some of the less well-endowed schools in Melbourne, the CFMEU provides breakfast for kids because a whole lot of kids turn up without having had breakfast. So at a most basic level, that's giving people the wherewithal to actually get through the day. And I think the work I originally did for Leslie was in 2001 was around the notion of skill ecosystems. You've got to look at the ecosystem around the community and who are the players. The school is one part of it, but that's why when we talk about a new settlement, you've actually got to look at what role are employers playing, what role are social policy agencies playing. I also think one of the big underutilised resources in our society is in aged care homes. There's a whole lot of people with a lot of time on their hands who are actually quite skilled. And I think we need to link the younger generation with an underutilised older generation. But that's what I mean by a new settlement. I think it's very hard for the education system to do that on its own. It must do it in concert with other social agents.
I'm going to now move to the last question.
Hi, David De Carvalho, Chief Executive of the New South Wales Education Standards Authority. So a few weeks ago, the Premier and the Education Minister announced that we'll be having a fundamental review of the whole of the New South Wales curriculum, the first time it's been done since 1989. So the board is meeting next week and is going to be finalising the terms of reference. We've already had extensive consultation with key stakeholders internationally as well as in the state and nationally. So my question to you, and I hope you each get a chance to answer it very quickly, is what's the one question you would suggest we need to answer in the review? Try to be a little bit more specific than how can we help kids flourish in the 21st century. And you don't have to explain why your answer is the answer, if you could just give it to us. Thanks.
Help him write the consultation paper. John, you start.
Yeah, I mean, if others want to speak first.
We'll go down the row. We're going to go down the row this way.
We actually take this up in the back half of the report, and it goes to that question I was posing earlier, what does the future of expertise look like? And we actually say that we need to think about what we call vocational domains. And this is something we're actually researching with the Department of Industry at the moment. Currently, the vocational education training system is structured around competencies which atomise skill and then aggregate them into fragmented qualifications. We actually say, what are the domains that give people an underlying expertise that can be deployed in a range of areas? The classic case is care work. Like currently we have aged care workers, disability support workers, drug and alcohol workers, youth workers. There's an underlying domain of care. How can we define that in a way that gives people the capacity to get an ability to think broadly and then be rapidly redeployed?
Okay, we're going to, if you want everybody, we're going to go fast. Emma.
Okay, well, I feel very on the spot, not working in the education system myself, but I'm on the board of AIM, the Indigenous Mentoring Experience, and was just reflecting on your point then about how are we helping kids that perhaps don't have a real cultural structure at home to help them with education. So I would be looking at not just the curriculum, but what's the holistic support around it.
Stacey.
Probably no surprise, my answer is what's the knowledge and understandings and the skills that students will need to thrive beyond school, and how can we create space in the curriculum to allow teachers to have some judgment about what that looks like as it lands in the classroom, whilst maintaining a high quality curriculum for all students.
Sandra.
Well, the good ones have been taken, so I'll go to the controversial one, which is, what would you take out? All these conversations about curriculum are about what we put in, and there's extra every time we do this. What do we need to take out to actually leave space to breathe? So.
Rafa.
You took another one. Well, I'm an engineer, so I have to talk about computers. I think looking into the impact of the technologies, not just as a productivity tool, but also the impact they have on the psychological well-being of the individual is very important.
Terrific. That brings to a close this session. We've got only a tiny bit more and then drinks. So look, please join me in thanking a terrific panel. Appreciate the time. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jackie Hayes. I'll be very brief. I've got the great privilege of working on this project with the department, and we get to work on a really broad series of issues, and we want to thank the Sydney University team for challenging us to think very broadly, taking a multidisciplinary approach. Some days it's utopian and some days it's dystopian, and some days it's both at the same time. And I think Sandra's comment about we're challenged by both the inequalities of hope and instilling a sense of agency explains both of those things that we're challenged by and we have to think through in terms of the Department of Education. So thank you for the panel. Thank you to Sydney University. Thank you to everyone who has joined us on the live stream as well. There's been a couple of hundred people who've joined us today. And we'd welcome everyone staying to continue this discussion with some refreshments out to your right. Thank you very much.